of course, in the real world, if the whole world froze all of a sudden, like that would be a very...
I think there'd be much bigger problems to deal with.
Right. And yet in virtual experiences, that's a fairly common thing.
I mean, in VR, we just call that a Tuesday. Happy Friday, everybody. I'm Brendan Bradley with the Fifth Wall Forum, committed to bringing together industry insiders from the theater and technology worlds to create opportunities for new kinds of virtual performance. And today, I'm having a conversation with the omnipresent Alex Coulombe, an architect turned ex-architect with a deep love of theater and architecture and the intersection of the two. Today's conversation is brought to you by the Fifth Wall Forum Discord channel, a robust community of almost 300 technologists and artists sharing job postings, tutorials, upcoming performances, and the home of Artifact Friday, where our mentors and collaborators share artifacts from their work, giving Fifth Wall Forum members a first glimpse at the latest in innovation in immersive storytelling. Find out more at our website at fifthwallforum.com. That's 5thwallforum.com. And now, let's get to the conversation. Welcome, Alex.
Thank you, Brendan. Happy to be here.
You have been in basically every conversation or phone call that I've been a part of for the last year. I feel like you know everybody, you're in every meeting, you're working on every project. Like, it is insane, the spread that you cover. It's like everybody I talk to, they're like, oh yeah, Alex and I were talking about that. I'm like, how does he do everything?
Well, I think I learned from the best. And I would say the same thing about you, that I meet so many people. It's like, well, Brendan and I were talking the other day. I'm like, oh, I'm so glad you're talking to Brendan. So, game recognized game, I guess.
Bring us into your entry point into this world.
Okay, so when you say world, we're going to have to define which world we're talking about.
See, already you're like, I do a lot of things. Which one you want to go? Which rabbit hole you want to go down?
Yeah, I mean, that actually goes all the way back to when I was much younger, let's say 11 years old. I saw this incredible lecture series that went viral. I think you can still find it on YouTube with Randy Pausch. This virtual worlds program that Carnegie Mellon had was all about bringing together these different disciplines and saying, hey, can we create worlds and stories and all sorts of cool things together? And I was like, oh my God, I want to be a part of that. And I was just kind of had that in the back of my head, like, well, I'm going to go to Carnegie Mellon and use technology and be a part of storytelling and think about spaces and architecture. And then when it was finally time to apply to colleges, I didn't notice that Carnegie Mellon required an SAT 2 in physics. And I was like, oh, it's past the deadline. I can't do that. So I went to Syracuse University, studied architecture, but the entire time I was part of the architecture program, I was always trying to find ways to use technology to automate things, to simplify things, to figure out ways for us to be more interactive with our spaces. Architecture, of course, being a medium that you really do need to experience at human scale, but for several thousand years, we've been representing it in non-human scale forms. So yeah, I mean, even before I got access to programs like Unity and Unreal Engine, I was using programs like Esperient and Quest 3D, that's very early, aughts software that allowed for taking your architecture model and then making it interactive and allowing you to cycle through design options and change things. And then my thesis at architecture school was, in fact, a theater. It was taking Fort J on Governor's Island and inverting the sight lines that were designed for the cannonballs and everything for the War of 1812 and saying, what if you turned those into theater sight lines and you had the audience in the middle, and then it had this kind of panopticon quality where the audience would always be slowly navigating around these 5 different stages. So it was kind of a lazy man's immersive theater. The idea being that there's all these stages and stories happening around you, but you don't actually need to get up and walk around. And so, yeah, and there, even this is 2009, I was using early augmented reality using a plugin called AR Media, where I just was able to take webcams around, have them look at a marker and say, okay, now you're in the theater. And I was very concerned about this idea that you might get FOMO if you're looking at the stages in front of you and wondering about the stages behind you. So I had everyone in the audience had control of a camera on a crane. Nowadays, it would just be a drone. But the idea was that you could have the second screen experience and you could experience everything behind you in a more free way because you could control this essentially flying camera around, but you were limited to the 2D screen you had. So you could say that emerging tech and architecture and theater have always gone hand in hand in my mind.
Wow. And does this come from you have that kind of burning sense of FOMO that there's other things happening in the space around you that you want to engage with and interact with?
Yeah, and in fact, you're making me realize I should have started earlier. I wrote my first play in high school. It was a 45-minute quasi-musical with like 100 set changes and projection mapping from PowerPoint, and it was absurd. It was a totally ridiculous ambitious experience for someone in high school to do as their first play. But I think FOMO is what kind of drives it, even for myself as a creator, because I'm always thinking like, this might be my only opportunity to do this, and I want to get everything in here that I could possibly ever want in a show. And, you know, of course, if I could go back and talk to my high school self, I'd say like, calm down, there's time. You don't need everything here. You're making a lot of those techies sweat. You know, some of them are probably gonna have to go to therapy about this in a few years. Maybe just relax a little. But yeah, there's a burning desire there that is always crossing disciplines and trying to do something new and exciting, and just very excited to collaborate with people who are talented in their field.
I feel like with the Fifth Wall Forum, what's so unique about our kind of band is that we have so many different, not just personalities, but kind of not just industries, even philosophies represented, and your thoughtfulness that goes into how we interact and engage with spaces. Do you have a sense of what your first kind of realization that you were having a relationship with space or a venue was?
Yes. So I remember I've always loved to draw. I've been sketching and trying to create narratives through images since I was about 2 years old. I had these big flip books of stick figures going on big adventures, and I wasted a lot of construction paper. But I remember when I was maybe 5 or 6 years old, and we were visiting my grandmother in Florida, and we were sitting on the beach, and I remember looking at the big condominium towers and starting to experience, let's call it, the negative space a little bit. Like I was aware of how these big high rises and then this big empty space between them were creating this other kind of spatial experience. And then I started to think about how that would be different if the shapes of the buildings were different or if they were closer together. And I started to just become much more aware of how a human inside a space, and really that initial thought of like compression versus release and openness, and then bringing that back to like lizard brain ideas and like, well, where does this all come from? It's probably similar to like when you're in the forest and then you come out into a big clearing and you realize like, okay, there's no predators around. And then and then just taking that through my architecture career now into the virtual worlds, and realizing, of course, that we aren't as limited by as many things, but I still have that excitement and curiosity about how do you encourage behavior and feelings and sensations through space making.
So now bringing that into the last year where literally we were deprived of a lot of physical spaces, what have been some of the lessons into the virtual world, and what are you excited about as we kind of quote unquote reopen and return to the physical world?
Great question. I really hope that we continue with, let's call it a hybrid approach, because the silver lining of all the awfulness of the last year has been forcing, let's say, more traditional theater makers and creatives to dive a little bit more into the technology pool and see what's out there and learn on their feet. And I hope that doesn't go away. So, for example, I hope that it's going to become more common for, let's say, for a live theater show that's happening in a real theater to actually have a virtual component, whether you know, and streaming is fine, like just streaming the experience from a camera. That's one way to do it. But I love the idea of thinking that we could start to get more comfortable with actors on stage also, you know, wearing some kind of mocap equipment under their clothes or on top or whatever. And then that starts to allow for, let's say, someone 1,000 miles away to don a VR headset and get very close to some other representation of that actor, whether it's very stylized or more photorealistic, but starting to take the beauty and joy and vividness of live experiences and expanding that out beyond the, you know, the people who can, let's say, afford to go see a theater show in person, and the people who can actually access it, because often you're only servicing people 20 miles away or so, unless it's like a Broadway pilgrimage experience. So I want to keep seeing those things expanding. The work you and I have done, of course, in places like Mozilla Hubs, which is very accessible and does not require a very expensive setup. I'd love to see more companies starting to explore that. And then, you know, it doesn't always have to be happening at the same time. You could have a show that maybe Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays is happening in the theater, and maybe Tuesdays and Thursdays are also doing a show that is more focused on the virtual audience. So it can be very difficult to try to service a physical audience in front of you and a virtual audience at the same time, which is something we picked up on quite a bit during Alive in Plastic Land, where we were trying to do that. So yeah, even just getting actors and performers more comfortable with bouncing between virtual audiences and live audiences, I'd love to see something like that continue forward.
In those hybrid experiences, do you see the physical space being represented virtually, or do you see tearing down the walls of the venue and letting the virtual experience be entirely separate and reimagined from the constraints of the physical theater?
Ooh, I really want those to play off of each other. I had a pitch for, it started as an opera and then became a few other things over the past few years, where the way that I would try to get people in the right headspace for this, I'd say, have you read Calvin and Hobbes? A lot of people have. I'll just say here, for those who don't know, it's a wonderful comic book series that ran for 10 years about Calvin, who's a 6-year-old boy, and he has an imaginary friend, Tiger, who might not be imaginary. Some of the situations Calvin gets in seem pretty crazy for someone to do all on their own. But the key takeaway there being that when Calvin is interacting with Hobbes, his pet stuffed tiger, he sees this incredible imaginary world. We'll say it's imaginary for the sake of argument. And then when the parents are involved, when grown-ups or even other kids are involved, it's a much more static, regular real world sort of thing. So what I was pitching as part of these initial ideas was an augmented reality experience in a theater where, let's say that the physical set and costumes and all that are very minimalist, very studio theater black boxy. And so people can just kind of see a show going on, and you're going to be seeing by default this kind of adult version of it, where if there's a kid playing in his imagination, you're seeing a kid playing and you can try to imagine what he's imagining. But using an AR experience, and over the years it's become, whether it's a tablet or Magic Leap or HoloLens or Spectacles or something else, the idea would be that would give you a portal into the world of this child's imagination. And so then looking up at that stage, something that was just a rehearsal cube now becomes a tree with flowing branches and really vivid colors. And you see all these other characters, any imaginary characters that this kid is playing with, they're there, and they're actually represented, of course, by actors who are not physically on the stage. They are somewhere else and they're live. But what you're seeing is exactly that portal from the child's imagination. Now, of course, I also like to imagine that a show like that could expand out to VR, where you have these different tiers of experience. Again, the non-technology version, you're just in a theater watching a show. The AR version, where you're in the theater, but you're seeing this other layer of reality on top of everything. And then a VR version that probably lives somewhere in between there, and probably is taking some elements from what's actually happening live on the stage, but then also takes advantage of certain things that you couldn't do if you're in the theater. Maybe in the VR version you can be God-sized and you can see the whole thing playing out at dollhouse scale, or you can actually impact what's on the stage in a way that you couldn't in the physical theater. So I'd love to see all of those things playing off of each other: VR, AR, the real world layers, digital layers, and I think there's so much untapped potential there that, there's a number of things holding that up, but it's all possible.
That's an amazing pitch and idea, and I feel like you're involved in so many incredible projects that are ongoing. And over the course of these interviews, as well as just in general in the space, what I constantly hear is people saying like, well, I just didn't really know how to get involved, or where to look, or where do I find out about these shows, or where do I get involved with these projects? How do you find these projects, find these people, find these collaborations to be able to bring these crazy things to life?
For better or for worse, I think I've inherited my father's people pleaser gene, where most of the projects I get involved with, they come from someone else who's saying like, hey, would you like to be involved in X, Y, and Z? And a lot of times I'm saying, yes, I love you. You're amazing. Let's do something. That's very much how you and I, Brendan, also ended up working together. It's usually someone else who's the driver. And when I am trying to pitch something, a lot of times, because I've never, raised money for anything. I've never gone out to VCs or tried to say, hey, please give us X number of dollars to do this thing. Those projects usually remain either prototypes or just things that I continue to say, wouldn't it be cool if XYZ? So most of the projects I've been involved with that have happened have come from elsewhere. They've been people who I've interacted with at conferences, or I've been able to talk about because of shared interests, or I get brought on. We haven't talked at all about Fisher Dax Associates yet, the theater design company that I kind of hailed from before Agile Lens started. But, you know, getting to work on designing real theaters all over the world, getting to do a bunch of work with the Park Avenue Armory and Lincoln Center. Kenneth Branagh's Macbeth was an exciting turning point for merging the real and the virtual for me. And yeah, having professional opportunities where I'm just being brought on and someone says, hey, Alex can make VR and AR experiences. Would you like him to pre-visualize all these different elements of the set design and the actor blocking and the lighting design? And I'm totally happy often for people to volunteer my services if I get to work on a cool project.
Now, on top of these projects, you're always putting out fun little like videos or experiments that you've worked on. I love your photo of this like bicycle helmet that you've modded to be able to face capture yourself. How much time do you usually put into tinkering on something on the side as like an experiment? Like, how long do you let something fail before you go like, nah, all right, this isn't really working, versus pushing through to that point that you found some new little trick or workaround that you then might reincorporate into your more day-to-day workflow?
That's a great question. I can speak about something I'm working on right now, which speaks to that pretty well. We're doing a, let's see, how do I do this without breaking NDA? It's a Globe theater. It is a Shakespeare-style theater that will be built in the real world. And I've got kind of a VR theater template that I've built up over the years that allows for anyone to pop on a VR headset and, you know, jump to the different seats and see how leaning affects your view and making sure obstructed views aren't that bad and that sort of thing. And for a while, I've been tinkering with this idea of like, well, you know, I'm never going to get everyone on a project to wear a VR headset. And especially over the last year with the pandemic, not as many people come into my office. So I was thinking like, how do I simulate the VR experience in the best way possible for someone who's just on a computer? And so I've been throwing in little bits of code in this project over the last like 3 or 4 years, none of which has come to fruition. And yesterday someone was like, hey, we're gonna have a meeting with the client, you know, tomorrow morning. So this morning, we'd like to show them X, Y, and Z. They're not gonna have a VR headset. Maybe you can wear a VR headset and show them what you want, what the different seats and the different design options we're thinking of. And I was thinking like, man, I'd love to give them a little more agency to actually see the experience. So I finally, last night, threw together a lot of this code I've had over the years and made the experience work much better as a hybrid version where, for example, we gave the client control of my mouse and keyboard, and I just laid out for them, you know, in like the Zoom chat, like, here's what all the buttons do. If there's any seat you would like to see, you can click on that seat during the Zoom share, and it will teleport me in VR to that seat, and then I can take care of like leaning in that.
That's cool.
Yeah, so we gave them a lot more agency over how we were viewing the theater, and they could of course cycle through the design options on their own. And then I just got to be the puppet who pretends to be a theater patron who's like, oh, I'm a little uncomfortable, let me lean forward more. And then of course we had my video going so they could see how uncomfortable I looked and how much I was leaning. So that's fun.
That's such a cool concept, and I also like the idea of vicarious attendance.
Yeah,
where like someone is attending something on your behalf and you're then instructing them on how you would like to experience the show. Like, it makes me think of I did this thing, Hourglass Escapes, during the shutdown, where it was an escape room in Portland. Obviously no one could go there during the shutdown, and so the owner just strapped a GoPro to his head, and you would Zoom with him, and then he played like an idiot that you had to like tell to go do the things and unlock the locks and like solve the puzzles.
Yeah, I'll say briefly, Dustin Freeman, who's a very cool experimental theater maker who you should get on the podcast. I believe he did an experience a little while ago where, yes, the entire, let's call it immersive theater experience, involved instructions in your ear, and some of it was live and some of it was triggered by you entering like certain rooms. But yeah, that kind of stuff is so fascinating. I'd love to see more work in that kind of space.
I'm gonna have to check that out. I'm always trying to expose myself to new work, and it's so hard to find sometimes. Is there a show you've seen that you think just really captures what works about XR performance, especially in theater?
Ooh, I mean, I just have to shout out the work on OnBoardXR, which I give all the credit in the world to you, Brendan.
Oh, stop
the
it.
Variety of shows that were a part of that experience, from more let's say proscenium style, but the idea of like, seated theater where you pick a spot and you watch a show and you just focus on the actors, and that of course being jettisoned, to the more immersive theater of what like Dasha and Ari were doing in This Land is I-Land, and then having a piece that was generated entirely from AI, and having Clem do her incredible dance where the audience could interact with it. The variety of that all in such quick succession, all within VR, I found that to be such a wonderful smorgasbord of things that I love in the real theater world, translated surprisingly well for a no-budget VR theater experience.
Okay, so when do you think the tech really works in a compelling way that supports your vision of the future of immersive storytelling?
Well, first of all, I love that you don't need to be on location for it. I haven't been involved too often on the tech side of real theater, but going through, let's say the biggest show that I was involved with was a large production of Equus at Syracuse University that the students were putting on, but I had to do the set design and the construction and had to be through all the tech rehearsals, and like that's a lot of work, as you well know from firsthand experience, going through all of that on site. And I loved both for Onboard and Jettison, and then also going back to Love Seat and Alive in Plastic Land, all these shows where I was able to just be at my home, sitting at a computer, playing with my kids, and then 5 minutes later sitting down and saying like, okay, now we're running the show. There's a real joy to the seamlessness of that. And then there's also something very exciting about feeling like there's not as much of a playbook for the right way to do this, because yes, you can take your cues from how it's done in the real world at a real theater, for example, but you can also find all these little tricks that have to do with the nuances of how coding works, whether it's JavaScript or in high fidelity, we had another language we were using in there. But yeah, I mean, let's say, for example, like changing the set. Like, of course, changing the set in the real world, you need people to do that. That often, I mean, maybe if you have a really robust fly tower system, it's all taken care of there. But the fact that we could have a UI and click something and like, okay, this set, flies up into the air, or it disapparates or disintegrates or disappears, and then a new set magically appears, and the ease of which we could do something like that and have it be like at a massive scale, where in the real world, yeah, you'd need a team of 100 people to do this kind of thing. That's really exciting. The simplification of the labor that goes into some of these incredible theater spectacle moments is awesome.
And when does the tech leave you wanting or needing something more?
Well, the bugs for sure. Like, there's nothing worse than something that just crashes for no reason and you have no idea why and you don't know how to fix it. And of course, in the real world, if the whole world froze all of a sudden, like that would be a very
I think there'd be much bigger problems to deal with.
Right. And yet in virtual experiences, that's a fairly common thing.
I mean, in VR, we just call that a Tuesday.
Yeah, that's a Tuesday, exactly. So yeah, I mean, if we can move towards something that has more stability, where things can work the way you expect them to after rehearsing them 50 times. In the real world, you rehearse something 50 times and the 51st time is probably going to go as well as the last few times. I still feel like any kind of virtual experience, there's just as much of a chance of something going wrong the 51st time as the first time, and it could be a totally new thing. So that still remains frustrating, but it's all worth it, because the joy of when things even go 90% well, there's nothing like that.
So from the outside, you appear to have this extraordinary ability to balance work and life. I mean, you've got kids, but you also have kids, as in goats, right? Like in this bucolic home in the wilderness.
We refer to our house, by the way, as Lower Vermont, because my wife and I hail from Vermont, and we always wish we could get closer to there, so this is the next best thing. Yeah, I mean, for better or for worse, going back to the people pleaser thing and just being a yes man, like I never want to say no to a new opportunity. In high school, hey, do you want to write a play for the One Act Festival? Sure, I've never done that before. Sounds fun. Any new technology or software or exciting thing, I want to do it, because I've been fortunate to be blessed with a shamelessness where I'm always kind of like, what's the worst thing that could happen? People are going to tell me I'm dumb, or that was stupid, or I shouldn't have done that. Whatever, that doesn't faze me too much. I've got it. And by the way, architecture school gives you a really nice thick skin for criticism, because you have professors in architecture school who will tear your work apart, and you've been up for 4 days working on it and you poured your heart and soul into it, and they're like, this is the worst thing I've ever seen in my life, and you need to learn how to take that.
Sounds like the creative arts.
Oh my God, right? Yeah, exactly. I mean, architecture and the arts in general all share that. And Yeah, and so I can't say that I've found the perfect balance yet, because I always feel like I'm leaving things out to dry that I should be spending more time on. But anytime a new opportunity comes up, I want to say yes, and then I try to dive into it as much as I can. And I try to find downtime to just like relax and play video games. But the fact of the matter is that if I'm trying to relax, the back of my brain is always saying like, but you could be working on that prototype right now, that other thing that's really fun.
Yes, I call those the whispers.
Exactly. Yeah, and all these things are so exciting, and we're so fortunate to live in a time where there's all these resources and YouTube tutorials and all these ways to teach ourselves things that, even 20 years ago, you'd need to dig up some 700-page technical manual to even get close to.
Mm-hmm.
So I think, yeah, you and I both, we really want to take advantage of these opportunities and jump into them. But then, yes, the family balance stuff, like, I'll say that without going through the whole story of my wife and I's courtship, like, we're high school sweethearts. And when we first started dating in high school, like, I was a pretty bad boyfriend, and she kind of taught me how to be a better boyfriend. And that led right up into, eventually getting married and having kids. So I'm learning so much from her and from our kids. And I guess that's what it comes down to, is I'm always trying to learn and do better. And every time someone's like, hey, Alex, that's not the right way to deal with the rooster when he's stopping you from getting the eggs, it's like, oh, okay, what's the better way to do that? And that just applies across the board to everything.
It is a lesson I definitely need to learn.
I am always trying to enjoy every second of life. I have an immense gratitude for my life, and I think I take a lot of that from my father, who was always working 80-hour weeks when I was growing up, not always in ways that he would like to be doing, but he always found the joy in everything and loves people, loves being in positions where he can try new things and do new things. He's an entertainer, by the way, I should say that. But I think that I'm always trying to be an optimist, glass half full, appreciative and joyful as much as possible.
So part of the purpose of this podcast is to check in with our community and see what they need to support their current work. Is there something that would help you level up one of your current projects?
Yeah, it's always collaborators and resources. Anytime a technology company has been like, hey, here, have a Magic Leap, what can you do with this, or something like that, that's always been a real joy. Whenever I've been fortunate to have an intern who's really excited and passionate about this space and just wants to dive in head first and learn as much as they can, that's always wonderful. And something that I think not a lot of people understand is that you can become I'm going to use the term expert very loosely. You can become an expert in something fairly quickly in these spaces, because no one is really an expert yet. And so if you're passionate and excited, and you're going to have an open mind and a curious mind and learn on your feet, I mean, you can do some amazing things. I'll use Unreal Engine as an example, because I've been working in Unreal Engine for 7 years now. And every couple days, I'll find someone who just started using Unreal Engine a week ago, and they're demonstrating some incredible technique or workflow that I was like, I didn't even know you could do that. And it's just because if people kind of follow their passions and their interests down certain rabbit holes, they're going to discover exciting things that no one else has seen before. So that's really wonderful to me. And I want people to feel not afraid to jump right in and try new things, because there's a lot out there to discover and find a lot of great satisfaction in.
Okay, so this is a bit of a trick question, but where do you think it's all going?
So I really want to believe that we're heading towards a future where theater is scalable and sustainable, and something that a lot of people can make a living doing. Thinking about the way Ari, for many years, Ari Tar has been thinking about Ractors, this whole idea from Diamond Age from Neil Stephenson, that people who are great performers are going to be able to find a living no matter where they are, as long as they have a decent internet connection, doing all sorts of different performances, whether they are escape room scenarios or immersive theater shows or more standard black box or proscenium theater shows, whether they are doing them in person or to a virtual audience or both. I think theater so often has been limited by the restrictions of the real world, and the virtual world opens up so many of those, and we just have to make sure that it can all be done within certain union contracts and all those regulations. But I really hope that we're heading towards a very creative theatrical future where we might not even call it theater anymore. It might be something totally new, but is taking its cues from that very spatial experience of being in an intimate space with an audience all waiting with bated breath as a really amazing reversal happens on stage right in front of you. That thrill and that catharsis is something that I believe we can get to in a virtual world, and I want more people to experience that, both on the performer side and the audience side. So that's theater. And then the architecture side, similarly, I want to believe that we're going to see more and more meaningful environments, virtual spaces that we can commune in and have meaningful interactions and opportunities. And so if the point of architecture in the real world is to encourage certain kinds of interactions and behaviors and psychological states when you're in them, then is it any different if people are performing the same functions as they would be in real architecture but in virtual architecture? I would argue no. And so I want to see more talented spatial thinkers and real architects getting into these virtual spaces. And then, yeah, when you start putting that together with something like, say, immersive theater, I'd love to see an incredible immersive theater experience that takes from real architects really opening up to what can be done in these virtual worlds. So you start to wed all the magic of being in VR, for example, in a spatial way at human scale or God scale, as the case may be, and really playing to those strengths. So we can get away a little bit from just thinking everything needs to be skeuomorphic and, mimicking the real world, and spread our virtual wings and fly.
That really speaks to one of the biggest lessons that I think you and I have experienced in our collaboration, is how the audience seems to bring the ritual of physical space to the virtual world. So how do you think we design these spaces to support that vision?
Yeah, and the way I think you're absolutely right, and the way I've interpreted that is, for people who are really comfortable in VR chat, you do a theater show in VR chat and it kind of feels like you're doing a theater show at their house or their dorm room, as the case may be. And so they feel a certain comfort in what they can do and what's allowed there. But the magic of theater has so often been that ritual of coming into a space, maybe a space you've never been in before, and following this procession into the lobby and then into the house, and then finding your seat and the lights go down and the curtain comes up. And there's a real magic to that. And so I think you're right. In Mozilla Hubs, we've been able to replicate a little bit more of that sensation. And most of the people coming in there are people who have not spent a ton of time in Mozilla Hubs or in virtual reality in general. So they're willing to take their cues from, Kevin as a great house manager, for example, and be good audience members. So yeah, we've been very fortunate for the people we've been able to bring through those experiences so far.
Speaking of bringing people together into these worlds, how can people get in touch with you for collaborations and information?
Well, the place I post all of my ramblings is Twitter, so find me on there at iBrews. And then I also still have my YouTube channel going, so sometimes if I create a little experiment video that's more than 2 minutes and won't fit on Twitter, that'll go up on YouTube, and that is also iBrews. I'll mention iBrews is a name I came up with when I was about 12 years old and was trying to come up with a handle. And I was thinking about there's all these things that start with the letter I for things that are on the internet. And then brews, I was thinking that someday I might be a coffee drinker, even though I didn't, and I still don't really drink coffee. So I was thinking about coffee.
So it was aspirational.
Yeah, kind of. And I was thinking so it'll be like internet concoctions. I was thinking about things that are mashed up together from different disciplines, and that would all come together. And then it was also play on words, because my most prominent feature has always been my eyebrows since I was 4 years old. And so it was eyebrows, eyebrews, that felt right. And I've just ran with it.
Well, I appreciate you running with me through a variety of topics on today's conversation, and I can't wait for my next conversation that I am sure will inevitably include you. I'll get on my next call and it'll be like, oh, Alex is here too.
To be clear, don't we have a call right now?
We do. Damn it. Thank you so much to Alex for joining me in the conversation. If you'd like to be in the podcast, you can contact me anywhere online using the handle Brendan A. Bradley, or go to fifthwallforum.com. This is Brendan Bradley wishing you a happy Friday, and I'll see you next time.
Delightful.
Oh boy.
Let's jump right over.
Yep. See you soon.